Hey everybody, welcome to Modern Shooter. And this right here, I bet you recognize it, but just in case you don't, it's a Colt Cobra 38 Special. Original box, original packaging, original documentation. It is the definition of a classic gun and something, well, almost any collector would be ecstatic to own. If you're a fan of guns like this, and really, I have no idea of anyone who isn't, if you're a fan of guns like this, you owe it to yourself to take the pilgrimage to the NRA Museum in Fairfax, Virginia. And really, the museum is as much a walk through American history as it is about the guns that helped shape that history.
You are going into the unknown. What's on the other side may know you're coming.
There are museums of art, of history, and of technology, but it's rare to find a place that brings all three together. Welcome to the NRA National Firearms Museum in Fairfax, Virginia. Each exhibit contains guns considered to be fine works of art, detailing our country's history and the technology that bred much of what we shoot today.
If you like guns already, you're going to love the museum, but the museum is as much about history as it is about firearms. The earliest type of firearm was very, very simple. It's called a hand cannon. It's just an iron tube closed on one end with a hole drilled partially through and then a hole at the rear. It was loaded with gunpowder, projectile on top of that, and then it was ignited by holding a burning ember to the touch hole that would ignite the powder in the barrel. Now, the oldest gun in our museum, and we think the oldest gun on display in North America, is a hand cannon, but a much larger one. This thing that looks like a rusty old sewer pipe is a hand cannon that dates from about 1350, which is when firearms were first being used in Europe. This was recovered from the ruins of an Austrian castle that fell in 1350. Next step in firearms ignition was the matchlock. And this was simply a hand cannon with a very simple device attached. Again, it was loaded with powder and projectile, has a little pan here to put gunpowder in, and then you would put a burning cord called a slow match. It was treated with chemicals to where it would smolder like a punk on the 4th of July, and when you were ready to fire it, if it wasn't raining and if the wind was okay and if your match was still burning, you'd pull the trigger, which would simply lower the match held in the serpentine into the pan of powder to ignite the charge. Folks who are interested in guns love the museum. People who may not be so interested in the subject matter, I think we kind of win them over. They see the artistry of the engraving, the remarkable ability to create these images in steel and wood. They see the historic roles that the firearms have played. It's the process of invention, the process of innovation, and these are themes that everybody can relate to, not just firearms enthusiasts. The wheel lock was arguably the most advanced mechanical device that was made at the time, introduced around 1500. Some people believe that Leonardo da Vinci came up with the initial design for these. But it has a large wheel inside the lock there with a serrated edge. And the wheel is wound with a spanner or wrench that attaches to this stud and is cranked. That wheel is held under spring pressure. And when you're ready to fire the gun, this set of jaws holds a piece of pyrite or flint, which is lowered against the edge of the wheel. When the trigger is released, the wheel spins against the pyrite, creates a shower of sparks, and ignites the charge that's in the barrel. Again, powder and projectile on top of it. The wheel lock we have here at the beginning of the museum kind of sets the tone for the rest of the museum. This wheel lock carbine is attributed as coming over on the Mayflower with John Alden. So our story of firearms in America begins right here.
Modern Shooter is brought to you by Aguila Ammunition. Feed your firearm. By H&H Precision Rifles. Engineering precision rifles and components for the world's most demanding shooters. Sig Sauer Electro-Optics. See the difference. By Securite. Intelligent firearm storage. By Gun Digest. We know guns, so you know guns. By Turnbull Restoration, specializing in the accurate restoration of historical metal finishes on period firearms. And by Benchmark Barrels, world-class accuracy made in the USA. Coming up next, the guns that won the West and how the Civil War started the NRA. This is Modern Shooter.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Modern Shooter. And this rifle scope right here, this is the new Sierra from Sig Sauer, and it's part of their BDX system. This technology represents the pinnacle of where we are today in the shooting sports world, but we've come a long, long way to get here in a very short amount of time. And that becomes extremely evident as you walk through the NRA Museum in Fairfax, Virginia. From some of the old Colts that won the West to some of the early long guns that come out of Kentucky. I mean, we've read about these guns, we've idolized these guns, but to get to stand there and look at them and wonder about the stories behind each specific gun, it's a rare treat.
Parker was arguably the finest maker of American shotguns, and like all shotgun makers, they offered various grades.
Jim Supika is the director of the NRA Museum. In addition to knowing everything about these guns on display, he has a passion for telling the stories behind each firearm.
The first truly indigenous American firearms design is the American long rifle, sometimes called the Kentucky rifle or the Pennsylvania rifle. A bunch of German gunsmiths came over, settled in the colonies. This was when a gunsmith took a hunk of wood and a hunk of iron and built a gun out of them. So these are handmade pieces. But the traditional Jaeger hunting rifle from Germany adapted to game needs in the colony. The barrel became longer to build up more velocity because the caliber was smaller to conserve lead. The stock developed a graceful droop to it, became full length all the way out to the muzzle, and the different gunsmiths would decorate these with ornate patch boxes and carvings. They're beautiful Kentucky rifles in this case, but my favorite gun in this case is the ugliest one, and it's got a great story. It's a Girardoni air rifle. Now, you hear air rifle, you think Red Ryder BB gun, you'll shoot your eye out, kid. That's not the case with this. This was developed in the late 1700s, early 1800s, and it throws a 46 caliber lead ball with enough energy to go through a 1-inch wood plank at 100 yards. The buttstock is the reservoir. It is pumped up with a bicycle-style pump to 800 psi. And Lewis and Clark had one of these that they took with them on their journey across America. Now, the tribes they met were very familiar with muzzle-loading flintlocks. They were using them for hunting and for warfare. They also knew that once a flintlock had been fired, it would take that guy 30 seconds or so to reload, and they could unleash a dozen arrows in that amount of time. The thing that was amazing about this Girardoni was not only its power and its silence when it was fired and its lack of smoke, but is this tubular magazine laying alongside the barrel. This is a 22-shot firearm that could be fired as fast as the hammer could be cocked, the lever pressed, and it would fire 22 times sequentially. You could pour another 22 lead balls down the magazine, and the air pressure would still have enough power to fire a second magazine. Now, to the tribes who saw this, this was an unimaginable level of firepower, and maybe they were friendly, maybe they were hostile, maybe they didn't give a damn, but the smart thing to do was let these guys go on upriver and let the next tribe worry about them. So if you had to pick a single firearm that you could say won the West, you could make a good argument for an air rifle. The vast majority of these guns have been donated by folks who are farsighted enough to see that the story of American firearms needs to be told to this and future generations. With the invention of the percussion cap system of ignition, the creation of an effective revolver became a possibility, and Colt was the guy who came up with it. Now, his first revolvers were made in Paterson, New Jersey. Collectors call them Paterson revolvers. This is the baby model. They were made in 3 different sizes. This is a tiny little gun. Looks very unusual to us, but you got to remember that when Colt invented this, nobody knows what a revolver should look like. So it's this little revolver. It has a folding trigger that folds out to fire. It has the 5-shot cylinder loaded with percussion caps. It was a revolutionary concept, and it was a complete failure. He went broke making these. But there was a Texas Ranger who had had experience with the Paterson revolvers and said, this type of firearm is exactly what we need for war on the Texas-Mexico border. He didn't know Colt was out of business. He called him and said, can you make 1,000 of your revolvers in a bigger model for the U.S. mounted rifles? Colt was eager to get back in the firearms business. He said, why, yes, I can. And he contracted with Whitney to make 1,000 of what became known as the Walker revolver, after the Captain Walker of the Texas Rangers. Now, this was a big gun. This was a 6-shot percussion revolver, and until the introduction of the .357 Magnum, it was the most powerful production repeating handgun. Only 1,000 of these, and 100 were made for the military, 100 or so civilian models. But among the survivors, a cracked or shattered cylinder is not uncommon. The cylinders were just too long, too powerful for the metallurgy. He reduced the length of the cylinder, reintroduced it as the Dragoon model, and the famous Colt firearms manufacturing firm was off the ground and running, never looked back.
Up next, the role that wars and conflict have had on new advances in the gun industry. This is Modern Shooter.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Modern Shooter. And although the NRA Museum has all the firearms you'd expect to be there, those that help shape both our country and other countries as well, there's also a huge collection of guns, guns that don't even look like guns, guns that make you look at them and go, huh, that's kind of weird. I wonder what people were thinking. Really neat stuff.
This era of the late 1800s, early 1900s is really fun and interesting. There are a lot of gimmicky ideas and just some fascinating pieces from this time period. There's more ways to conceal a handgun than making it small enough to fit in your pocket. And the late 1800s, mid to late 1800s, was an era of a lot of gimmick and unusual handguns, including cane guns. Now, Remington manufactured cane guns. This particular cane gun is a percussion model. You simply load it like you would any muzzle loader. This button here is your hammer. It conceals your percussion cap, and when you cock the hammer, the trigger pops down and it is ready to fire.
As firearms technology advanced, most of that advancement was brought about by some sort of necessity, and more often than not, that necessity was conflict.
It's actually one of these early conflicts that started the NRA, and as you walk through the museum, the stories that go hand in hand with the guns are amazing.
We're entering our Civil War gallery, and in this gallery we try to illustrate the Civil War. On my left-hand side you have the North, and they had the manufacturing might. They were turning out hundreds of thousands of well-made, well-designed, well-fit and finished firearms to supply their troops with. Across the hall, we have the South. The South had virtually no firearms manufacturing capability at the beginning of the war. The few plants that started up, you measure their output in the hundreds instead of the hundreds of thousands. But what the South had that the North lacked was a tradition of hunting and shooting and outdoorsmanship. A lot of the Southern boys had been feeding their families with a gun. A lot of the Northern boys were coming straight out of factories, had never had a gun in their hands before they entered the service. And at the end of the war, a group of Union generals got together and said, we gotta never be in this situation again where our recruits know nothing about firearms. So they formed an association for the training and practice of firearms marksmanship. They called it the National Rifle Association, and that's how we got our start. You know, you hear about Eli's cotton gins and Henry Ford's assembly lines, but those processes were really begun primarily in the firearms industry. So you're not just looking at the history of firearms when you look at the guns here. You're looking at the history of firearms technology, of manufacturing in America, and of the American economy. They say you always enter a conflict with the perfect gun for the previous conflict. That was certainly the case for the U.S. in World War I. The issue rifle was the .03 Springfield. It was a 5-shot bolt-action repeater chambered for the powerful .30-06 cartridge. It was very, very effective for warfare across great distances, for the stalemates of the trench warfare of World War I, where machine guns and chemical weapons had changed the face of warfare. They were not the right gun. One of the greatest firearms designers of the era, John Pedersen, took an approach to developing an appropriate firearm for trench warfare, utilizing the .03 Springfield. It's called the Pedersen device. Basically, you remove the bolt from the .03, you replace it with the Pedersen device, and what you have now is a box magazine fed 30-round semi-automatic rifle. Now, as you can tell from the size of the magazine, these cartridges are much less powerful than the full-length .30-06 cartridge, but at the close ranges, this was intended to be used in trench warfare. A 30-shot semi-auto was much more practical and useful than a 5-shot bolt-action rifle shooting a cartridge that was effective for 400 or 500 yards. The war ended before these could actually be issued to the troops, and the vast majority of Pedersen devices were destroyed by the U.S. government, making this a very rare item. One of the items that always catches people's eyes is the big Barrett 50 caliber sniper rifle. There's been quite a bit of publicity on these recently. They fire a cartridge that was originally developed for the 50 caliber Browning machine gun, very effective as an ultra long range anti-personnel and anti-material rifle. But the Barrett was not America's first 50 caliber sniper rifle. In the Korean War, Major Bill Brophy had taken a captured Russian anti-tank rifle and mounted a 50 caliber machine gun barrel and topped it with a universal scope, and it was used for sniping in the Korean War. Military rifle developments have always fed the commercial sporting firearms market. Developments in the sporting firearms market have always fed the development of military arms.
Coming up next, the iconic guns behind Dirty Harry, Lethal Weapon, and American Sniper. This is Modern Shooter.
If you're a fan of the movies, you already know what a huge role firearms play on the silver screen, from Dirty Harry's classic .44 to the gun that ultimately killed Jaws. Those classic firearms live on to this day. Where? The NRA Museum in Fairfax, Virginia.
But what we have on display here are Hollywood guns. These are guns from 80 years of Hollywood movies, over 100 movies, and they're the guns that were actually used in the movie. We have the bolt-action rifle tricked out as a sniper rifle that was used in the movie American Sniper. It's an exact replica of the one that was actually used in the service. The Star Wars Blaster is a World War II British submachine gun frame with windshield wipers blades glued on the front of it and a counter off an obsolete Xerox machine used as a sighting device. On the bottom row, we've got the Beretta 92. This was used by Mel Gibson in Lethal Weapon, and also by Bruce Willis in Die Hard. To the prop company, it was just another prop gun. Both actors used it as their principal sidearm in their famous movies that started those franchises. Right next to it, we have the H&K P7 M13 that was used by Hans Gruber in Die Hard. It's not Christmas until Hans Gruber falls off the Nakatomi Tower. And on the bottom shelf, we've got two of the most beloved M1 Garands in Hollywood. In the front, we have the Garand from Gran Torino, used by Clint Eastwood, Get Off My Lawn. And in the back, we have the Garand that was used in Jaws to blow up the shark. Sometimes a gun becomes so famous that it's kind of the co-star in the movie. That's certainly the case with this Model 29 Smith & Wesson 44 Magnum that was used by Clint Eastwood in Dirty Harry and Magnum Force. Go ahead, make my day. The guns that mean the most to me are the ones that have a story associated with them, where we know who the owner was, and we have guns of presidents, of generals, of American soldiers, Wild West figures, of exhibition shooters, trick shooters, competition shooters, and just common hunting firearms that have meant a lot to the shooters who have owned them over the decades.
To learn more, go to nramuseum.org. Be sure to check out Modern Shooter and Gun Digest online and on Facebook.